All right, welcome. It's your man, Dyer. I'm here with this cartoon man here. As you can see, his name is JimBob. What's up, JimBob?
Hey guys, what's up, Jay? Thanks for having me on.
Thank you for coming back. You are a hallowed, respected guest here. We love you.
Thank you. I love coming back here because the truth is I don't really get to talk to a lot of people directly about a lot of issues.
You live in a hovel underneath the earth, correct?
Basically, Colorado.
You live in the Shire in a small hovel, and you don't emerge to the upper world.
Yep. My only contact is rapid thumb movements on a tiny glass screen. That's how I find truth.
Mr. Frodo, I'm so glad to talk to you, Mr. Frodo. Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew. Exactly. I don't know what we are here. Welcome, everybody. We have new members. We have people that have joined. We got a new member here. What's this guy's name? No, I can't see his name. Viewer activity. The Translator. Welcome, Translator, for joining us at the membership at Jay's Analysis. And shout out to Aaron and Melissa. I'm wearing my gift, my Christmas present or birthday, I don't remember, from Aaron and Melissa, my Nicolas Cage shirt. And then we have Cartoon Man with us tonight, Mr. JimBob himself. You can find his links below if you would like to follow him on IG or check out his website over at the madebyjimbob.com site where you can purchase his books. Is Savage Memes, is the new one out?
Yeah, volume 2 pre-orders are out now, yeah.
Now, I've got one. Jamie was just flipping through it yesterday. She was cracking up. Jamie wanted me to tell you that she is enjoying Savage Memes 1.
Good. Thank you.
And tonight we have a laid-back, chill chat session we're going to do. JimBob said we were going to do a debate. Can we talk about that? But I don't guess.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I follow this guy, Austin Peterson. I think he ran for some political position. And he's a, free market libertarian guy, hardcore. I don't know if he leans anarchist or not, but he debates people and he's, he's well-spoken and he can hold his arguments. And I figured that's a good matchup for Jay. So, I mean, he's down. He does a lot of, due diligence because, when you get into politics and the public sphere, you have to preserve your future by somehow avoiding potential futures of like, oh, damn, I debated this guy and he turned out to be like a, white supremacist or school shooter or whatever. So, I don't take that approach because you can't control any of that. I figure you just get out there and say what you believe, and if you can debate someone about it, that's awesome.
Yeah, well, when it comes out that I'm an anime tentacle porn
producer
hobbit, I dress up like a hobbit and I combine tentacle prawn with hobbits.
Right.
Then Austin will find out that he will have regretted not only debating me, but having lost to a man that has a hobbit fetish.
Exactly. And that's, I mean, he probably dodged a bullet.
That. How do you come back from that? You can't come back from that.
Yeah, so I figured we can incorporate what you would have been debating him about, which is like, God and state. So
you're going to put on your libertarian suit tonight and we're going to debate if you were him.
Yeah, I could totally go back not even that long ago, maybe a year or so ago. I was blowing that trumpet. But that all falls apart quick if you really examine it. And then a lot of atheism talk on my page. I bring up morality a lot.
Yes.
And the I forgot his name, but the Church of Eternal Logos. He did a great video, and I've heard you make a lot of these arguments, and he put it in a new form, the transcendental argument, and I thought that's such a powerful argument that really isn't made. It's hardly, I don't think I've ever seen it made by even near mainstream apologists.
Right.
They start from what you call the classical foundational perspective, that's what I wanted to talk about as far as atheism and critiquing it. Like as soon as you critique atheism, it automatically turns into the default place is that classical foundationalism, which if those of you listening, it's just basically like, correct me if I'm wrong, Jay, is a stance on truth based on like empiricism, observable stuff, induction, things that we're just immediately when we enter the world, that's what we're given as a tool to distinguish what truth is. And so most people sort of respond to that, atheists and theists, they kind of go to that. And it's really not the starting point of the conversation because the atheist is going to go right to the historicity of the Bible and moral claims about what happened in the Bible or how people use religion for terrible things. All these basic things we always hear over and over again. But the transcendental argument, starting from a point where you can't even do empiricism or science or any of this work without sitting on top of a bedrock of immaterial absolutes we just accept.
Exactly.
We just accept them. And just accepting them is not really valid if you really want truth and you really want to push logic and reasoning. You can't just say, well, eventually, we don't know where all these things come from. We don't know why math, the inerrancy of math and logic and all of these things we can't prove using empiricism and science. We can't materialize these things. You can't say, eventually we'll find out, because that's just going back to empiricism by saying, well, eventually we'll just find out what the source is, like where they come from. Mm-hmm. And so you're just back to square one. So I think that's really the core argument for an atheism, and why it's not even a good idea as a theist to start arguing from that place, from a material standpoint or a historical standpoint. You're not even there yet. You have to. That argument is only for separating the wheat from the chaff as far as other theologies and beliefs go, because you can't even you'd have to establish God as a necessity first using logic. And a little bit about my story is that like I was atheist like 15 years straight up until less than 2 years ago. Okay. And then I went to sort of agnosticism and pantheism, but not knowingly, just kind of like you do it in that new age way where it's like God is everything. It's just spirituality, man. It's all the same. And then you're not really scrutinizing your view using logic. When you start doing that, you can't really take that approach because it falls apart. And so that started happening with me where I found people like you, even Owen Benjamin pointed right to logos, and I started investigating that and growing up religious and rejecting it. I'd never once heard the word logos in my entire life. So it's fun to debate and talk about it that way because you're not even into what is mostly seen as ridiculous stories or parables and all these things. We're not even talking about that yet. We're just talking about, can you justify these immaterial things that we use, like that we accept just on face value? Like they're just, I don't know, they're just given. That's just the way it is. It's like, that's not a good enough answer for me. And I think it's not a good enough answer for a lot of people. And so that's where I'm at now is like, I broke through the logic barrier and I'm like just still a novice in logic and philosophy. And so I'm like, wow, this is such a good argument. Like you can't, it's never been broken.
From the opening of our chat, my mind went to my hobbit foot fetish, and I've just kind of been stroking. Yeah. I've been stroking the lengthy pelt of hair on the top of my feet. So I have no idea what you said for the last 5 minutes. Good. Could you just repeat all that? Yeah.
Well, it's everything you've probably said too many times in a video.
I'm just joking, Mr. Frodo. I'm joking. Yeah, I'm glad to hear that, man. I'm glad to hear that you rediscovered an interest in the categories or the structure of reality, which we could call that logos. We could talk about in Orthodoxy the logi, which are the principles and structures within the world that show that it is ordered, that we don't actually live in a chaotic, meaningless, random, chaos, just pure chance universe. There's actually a lot of order and structure and meaning behind everything. Even things that are seemingly innocuous still in some way have structure and order to them. Even the notion of chance as a concept is still, as Aristotle said a long time ago, it assumes some conception of order. And I think Van Til later made the same argument from Aristotle, where he says that even if you're going to talk about the notion of chaos or of chance, that itself assumes some other principle of order. I don't mean this in a dualistic sense. It's just that what you start to realize about what you're calling this sort of transcendental philosophy is that, to put it simply, anything that we talk about necessitates or will imply other things. And so certain phrases, arguments, beliefs about morals, you name it, they will have conditions that are necessary for that to be the case. So, for example, if we were going to argue, coming to the table to have a debate, a discussion, assumes the necessary condition of there being standards of logic and argumentation. There's no standards of argumentation or logic that bind both of us at the table at the debate table, or even if we're playing chess, right? If we're playing chess, there's rules of the game that we both got to abide by in order for this game to function for its purpose. Otherwise, we're not playing a game. We're just basically screwing each other over, right? Like, I'm hiding the chess piece. I've got the queen in my mouth, right? You won't see the queen, but she's in my mouth, right? I mean, we're not playing the game, right? We're playing some other game. And in the same way, when we're talking about transcendental categories, or if people get lost in this verbiage, it's really pretty simple. We're just simply talking about the things that maybe we don't immediately think about in discussion or debate, but the things that debate assumes or presupposes. And it's not just debate, it relates to ethics, morals, all kinds of things. But debate's just an easy way to talk about it, right? Like language, right? What is something that language or conversation presupposes? Well, that words have meaning. If I can't convey meaning to you through language, then there's no point in talking, right? So meaning and words conveying meaning is a necessary condition for the experience of conversation or language. And so that's what a transcendental argument is just simply looking at what are the necessary conditions for X, Y, Z to be the case. And if we do engage in X, Y, Z, then by necessity, these conditions are necessary. And so ultimately, we're saying that if you were to take all those necessary conditions for language, for thought, for math, for ethics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, it points us in the direction of God. God really does seem to be the perfect means by which we can explain all that and reconcile those problems that are perennial problems for philosophy.
Right, and it's not just an agreement like the game of chess, how someone created the game and then created the rules, and then we just follow them, and it's like a convention. And some other place in time could have had different rules. It's these things. Like I had a conversation with someone, and they were suggesting that we just created logic, or kind of evolved into place to make sense of the world. Yeah. And you're like, that alone is already out in the weeds. Like, just if you really examine that statement alone. But if it's just convention, then that's suggesting you can change the laws of logic, and we can argue differently. And then to argue that you can change laws of logic, you need to adhere to the laws of logic to make a convincing argument, and it just goes into absurdity. And I'm really surprised at the level at which people are at least willing to, not in person necessarily. I can't really derive what's truthful about people from the internet. I learned that, but that they're willing to accept absurdity. They're just willing to be inconsistent or incoherent with their views, and not really live the way they think or believe. Mm-hmm. And I feel like there's no place to argue really with the people who aren't willing to examine it. But there are a lot of people. I mean, I got like hundreds of messages since I've been kind of invoking that particular argument and not even trying to prove a God or a specific God. I'm just putting people on the hot seat of going, everything that you're drawing from reality, like that you are calling materials or like empirical evidence and all of these things, you're relying directly on these immaterial things we accept, language, math, number theory, truth itself as an idea that we're discovering something that preceded our ability to discern it. Yeah. That alone puts you in a position where you have to accept that you're making an atheist. And I know everyone's like, no, there's agnostic atheists, and they want to break them all. Even agnostics are they're making a metaphysical claim by merely practicing any sort of empiricism. They're as a result of doing it and participating in it and believing the results because it matches up with reality or their senses, they're already relying on all these immaterials. And it's really not the conversation could really just stay there for a little while. Like I feel like I don't even have to push them into one direction or not, because they can't. You just don't let them get out of that hole. Like, no, justify them. And then if you don't, the path of the argument, or if it's a debate, like you and Dillahunty, he eventually has to undermine logic. That's the only move you could make. You have to go to nihilism. Like a knowledge nihilism or whatever you'd call it, like epistemic nihilism, where you're just like, well, we can't know anything. And then you realize, like, someone makes that claim and that you can't know that either.
That's a knowledge claim, right?
So it's like, and people categorize this and they go like, you're just doing all this gibberish roundabout talk. And it's like, no, this is old. These are old. These are very old conversations that got abandoned. You would probably know a better time and place where that started to happen, where we just were like, let's just assume, like, it's this idea that things are just self-evident and that's enough justification. No, a tree is self-evident. It doesn't justify how it grew or anything like that. It's just there. That's not enough for me. I don't think it's valid for anyone. And that's why I think it's such an important argument. And then you can go into, like, once you get people to admit that if they believe in truth and knowledge, and that exists independently, or at least it took precedent before our abilities to really master our reason and logic to discover the truth, you have to admit that the truth must be of a mind, because all information and knowledge is of a mind. Right. There's no place where information and knowledge and wisdom, morality, language, math isn't of a mind. So your only option is to submit that there's a greater mind. You can call it, you can get into all this, like, people can go crazy inventing what that mind is, right? They can say simulation or the aliens. That's fine, because it opens the door, because it's infinite regress game. So you can use logic to keep peeling away what's not logical, at least. But the only other option is to say, no, truth and knowledge is just made up. And so I think that's why you don't see this many debates starting from there. I think people like William Lane Craig know it's just going to be like stuck in traffic debate. It's not going to be entertaining, because you're going to push people into only one or two directions. But I still feel like that debate is important, even if it's 7 minutes.
Yeah, I think William Lane Craig is an interesting example, because at times he'll use transcendental arguments, and then he'll also at the same time utilize arguments that are more in the evidentialist, classicalist framework, which kind of ignores the question of whether our views or beliefs are theory-laden. I would say that anything that we know, any object that we experience, is part of a paradigm, part of a theory that we have about the world. So we're interpreting the evidence through that paradigm. So in my view, I did a critique of William Lane Craig a few years ago, just talking about his apologetic method, where he's good, where he's not so good. And he does at times utilize transcendental arguments. So I appreciate that about him. But I think a lot of people think that, well, this is just like one argument amongst many. But I think if you're more consistent with it, you realize that it's not just like a one tool in a tool belt. It's actually a different way of looking at reality itself, because you're talking about the preconditions for reality, the preconditions for knowledge, the preconditions for ethics. So rather than just jumping into the game and assuming that we're all on the same footing here, that we all have the same approach to these questions, which we don't. For example, if I'm talking to a guy who's a materialist atheist and I talk about what it means for the world out here to exist, his notion of existence is completely different to my notion of existence, even though the word itself is the same word. For me, this world is a created world. I believe that God created it ex nihilo, out of nothing, on the basis of the divine ideas and patterns that he had for what he chose to create. For the atheist, there is no precedent cause or precedent mind or divine mind. It just is. It just sprang into being. It exploded, Big Bang. It just came to be. It's always been here. Eternal return. Who knows? Whatever is just there. It just is, right? So that's two radically different approaches to what's out there, what exists. And so just because we might use the same terminology of believing in, well, things in the world, quote, exist,
right,
we have completely different conceptions of what that means for a thing to exist. I mean, for me, for us, that the logos not only is the cause of being, he's also the sustainer of being, and he's also the telos, or the purpose of being. So that objects exist and possess or have being as a property or an attribute, or when we're doing metaphysics or ontology, this is something that is directly connected to, in my view, a kind of a theology. For the typical sort of atheist, whatever materialist perspective he wants to go down, because there's different schools in that thought, he might think that reality is just a bunch of ideas. There have been atheistic idealists, some of those. You could argue Plato is a kind of an atheistic idealist in a way. There have been more just matter is all that there is. There's no concept. Everything is just pure solidity, pure physicalism. Most of philosophers and scientists today would probably fall into that category of being sort of just naive physicalists. And so they really just don't even ask these questions anymore. Like you said, these questions are kind of just pushed to the background. That's why you see people like Neil deGrasse Tyson saying, well, I think he had a famous quote 2 years ago, step away from philosophy. We don't even do philosophy. Who cares about it? It's a worthless thing. Well, it's worthless because it's actually pressing him and other people in his scientism camp on things that they have to completely ignore and just dispense with and pretend like, well, we don't have answers to those things, and so we just don't ask those questions anymore. Now, what do? We do what works, and so what dominates is pragmatism. But what does that even mean?
Yeah, that's all back to arbitrary, because it's based on goals. Yeah. So I want to address something. Someone said, why is Jim just presenting back to Jay what Jay presents to atheists? And it's, for one, I'm discovering these arguments and presenting them to people that I took over from my account onto Jay's, and repetition of these things. The reason we're in the place where we are, where we're not adhering to logic and reasoning, is because people have been repeatedly lied to similarly, like in school. So repetition is super important. The reason why these arguments are going to be similar is because they're powerful arguments. We don't own these arguments. We're discerning these arguments. They're not Jay's arguments. They're not my arguments. They're all for you. And so repetition is good. Learn these arguments. It's really important to learn them and to be able to argue them to people, because there are people who want to know how to do this. Absolutely. They want to know what's real. They want to know what's true. They're looking for good. They're looking for God, and there's a lot of repetition that's leading them in other directions. So repetition is super important, and I really don't see that as a dig. But,
yeah, I agree. Yeah. And it takes repetition sometimes just to learn even the basics, right? I mean, I remember the first time I encountered these kinds of arguments, this sort of meta logic, you could call it. I didn't get it. Like, it took me a little while at first to understand what was being argued here. That because as you said, I think we all kind of just assume what we call the classical foundationalist model. We all assume that, well, how else could you reason about the world other than reasoning from the particular instances to a general rule, right? I mean, isn't that all reasoning? We just look at this instance, that instance, that instance. Water boiled at 100 degrees then, now, and in the future. We just assume water is going to boil at 100 degrees. So we reason from the general from the particular to the general. We do that inductive process. I mean, what else is there? I mean, that's what science does. What are you guys even talking about? Is it not just word salad? No, that's not all that there is to reasoning. Because, for example, one of the great disciplines that really hones in on this is the philosophy of science itself. There's a whole discipline called philosophy of science, which looks at the way science itself operates. What are the assumptions? What are the bases? What's the philosophy of science, right? Now, many people who do science, engineers, biologists, whatever, don't actually stop to think about the philosophy of science. I'm not saying that they're bad or that they have to, but it's interesting that many people don't do that because they launch into disciplines, they launch into these things. I've met people with PhDs in biology who wouldn't even know, they don't even know like basic fallacies. They wouldn't even know what it means to be ad hoc. Why is it wrong to be ad hoc, right? What's tu quoque? Why is that wrong? Right? What's affirming the consequent? Why is that wrong? Right? They wouldn't even know what basic reasoning fallacies are because they're invested in the pragmatic approach, which is dominant in American education, of just doing the thing and making it work without thinking about theory. It's all praxis, no theory. Yeah. But we need both of these things. We need to look at the methodology and the philosophy of the thing as well as doing the thing. You can't just have one without the other. And so many people in modernity, they just assume that you can do science and it doesn't matter. Who cares about these philosophical questions? But as Husserl said long ago in his famous book, Logical Investigations, he pointed out, as a mathematician looking at science, he says, science is actually operating on the basis of logic. Do you scientists not realize this? He actually calls them out. He's like, you don't realize that the scientific method itself presupposes and assumes logic as a process of reasoning from particulars to conclusions and theory, right, from thesis to conclusion, right? That's a logical process. And it doesn't just assume generic logic. Like, it's very precise. It's very intricate insofar as it utilizes these immaterial abstract principles and objects, right? Which that's not the immediate subject that's under purview, right? If you're studying the earthworm, if you're studying, cancerous growths on the anus, you may not be thinking about logic, but I assure you, you're using logic even when you're studying the cancerous growths on the anus.
Right. Yeah. I think the abandonment or just kind of the scoffing at it is when you said pragmatism, it also leaks into everything else. Like, I look at pragmatism and how it's impacted the kind of products and services and things and the way we consume entertainment. It's just like it's all serving a direct pragmatic function or giving us cortisol or dopamine. And if you really take philosophy and logic and theology, that guides a different process. I mean, we look at it even, to take a tangent, it's like how we build things. Like squares, living inside squares is not beautiful or flowing. It stops, it's a visual of the stopping of energy, like just these angles, as opposed to beautiful arches and pathways and piazzas and all of these things. It's not just a waste of space. It represents something else that we would appreciate, given, in my view, God. By addressing it, things were made in the image, but things that we create are to represent a standard of beauty. That's why they said a statue made for the gods. Like, this highest standard of what we create, it's gone. We've replaced it with that standard and replaced pragmatism and just function, utility, just direct.
Pure function, utility, exactly. And this has an effect in the realm of aesthetics as well, exactly, even into the point of architecture, where if you look at communist architecture, for example, Bauhaus, this kind of stuff, it's very functional. It has no flowery thrills and frills. It's all purely functional, form over content, right? It's all about the form and function. Like, what is there's nothing to beautify if something is purely functional, right? So when you go to a classroom and your classroom looks like a jail cell with gray painted what am I trying to say? Like gray walls, and you've got fluorescent lights, which are just hideous, right? And what does it look like? It looks like a prison or a Walmart, right? Giant fluorescent lights, concrete walls, concrete blocks, painted gray. There's the loss of the aesthetic there, because the rationale for this whole project is purely functional, and it doesn't matter actually whether it's consumerism or communism. Both have the same principle of radical pragmatism, radical function.
Right. And an efficiency isn't necessarily good. Like, if you look at like how to efficiently stack boxes in a truck, it's all squares and cubes. Maybe an M&M shape you could argue is efficient as well, but the efficiency in how we experience the world and how we live, it's like spatially, it's not the same as producing something and moving material. Like we've taken efficiency and pragmatism to a new level where we're just assume like, no, efficiency is good. It's just good.
Well, efficiency becomes its own purpose or telos in itself.
Right.
But on what basis? Why is that a purpose?
Right.
It becomes circular.
Yeah. And also efficiency, you can be efficient in doing horrible things. Like
exactly. It doesn't actually give you any standard of the good. It just it's purely functional. So I mean, a nuclear bomb is really good if your goal is to kill everybody. If the nukes are real, by the way. Like,
yeah, exactly.
Setting aside the skepticism of pick something else. I don't know. Like, the Death Star is really, like, it works really good. It's very pragmatic for blowing up planets, right?
Well, speaking of the pragmatism, back to the first issue is that anyone else who's like, that's why I mentioned Jordan Peterson, because I troll him and I counter him. He probably never sees it, but I do deal with his disciples, and they are very angry at me. But
why are they mad at you?
Just because I troll him in funny ways, but I'm smug about it.
Does he get cartoonized?
So, what's that?
Does he get cartoonized?
No, I do an impersonation and a cartoon.
Oh, those videos. Okay, the little clips.
Yeah.
They don't. You do the perfect. Like, I can't. My Jordan Peterson is like.
No, you're pretty good. You have
mine's
a way
75%. Yours is like 99%, dude.
Plethora of impersonations. But yeah, what I saw about the transcendental argument is that it argues for the necessity of God. And then I was like looking at Peterson stuff, and I get people who are like, no, at least he's just opening the door and like getting people to at least talk about, God and explore the possibility. But I look at it and I looked at some of his work in his language, and what he does is he argues for the usefulness of God as a like a sort of a archetype, or like I said on my stream the other day, like a Tekken, when you're playing Mortal Kombat, you want to choose a guy who's best for the role. Like if the role was like life lessons and stuff, he just picks God, but he only as a model, only as a conceptual idea to transfer.
It's another form of pragmatism, isn't it? Like, it
leads to
pragmatism. Pick this thing because it helps. It works.
Yeah, exactly.
Who cares who cares if it's real or not? You can't actually speak about what's real in the external world anyway. Right.
And then I was like, wait, maybe that is real, but I've heard him talk more explicitly about God and Jesus, so I didn't really know. And then I looked up a clip where he's explaining to Sam Harris, who just asks him point blank, like, to define him, and he riddled off like 10 definitions that were all changing, and the guy who made this video intercut it with Deepak Chopra with his, and they were almost identical. It was uncanny. It was so crazy, but it wasn't surprising. I was just like, Deepak Chopra was like, God is the ultimate way to path to the greatness, and then Jordan Peterson's like,
from here.
Exactly.
They
and
took
Peterson's
the God
like,
from here.
Exactly.
Yeah,
and then Peterson's like, God is the ultimate mode of being to live out the potentiality of the, and it's just he's getting away from certainty. He makes his whole work is based on uncertainty. And I say, like,
and that's why I've fussed for years about his main disciple in Orthodoxy, Jonathan Pajot, who spent 3 years hawking Jordan Peterson to everybody in Orthodoxy as if this was the greatest thing, and then counter signals me for like 3 years straight, and then I finally just got tired of that guy. And that's why he says the exact same thing about historical events, and that we can't really, can you really say what it means for something to be historical? I mean, you ask these people, is God real? Does it really? Depends on what you mean. Yeah. But what does it really mean for something to be historical? We don't really know what that means. It's as if like just some sort of existentialist Kantian bullshit. Like, I don't know Kantian stuff. I mean, I've studied this stuff at a graduate level. I know what Kant says. I know that when you divorce the noumenal realm from the phenomenal realm, and they're trying to pass this stuff off and like, oh well, it's symbols and it's like, I haven't read freaking Carl Jung. Like, I read Carl Jung.
It's all symbols, and people use it, but the argument for usefulness is not the argument for truthfulness.
Exactly, it's not an argument.
And he takes people out of facing south. People always say this, dude. He helps a lot of people. People are facing south and nihilism.
That's another pragmatic
and I'm like,
argument.
yeah, but
what does it mean
he
to help
takes
somebody?
them and he pushes them to east and west and calls it north. That's the problem. Is that and people are like, well, what's the problem? Why do you have to? And I'm like, because I care. Like, there are people sort of in limbo of going, like, trying to find what is good. Like, what's the objective truth? Like, how to live a good life? What is the standard? How do you justify the standard? And he's just pulling them and going, like, I'll take you out of that dark place and put you in the left, like going over to the left and battling chaos, but too much chaos could be bad, but too much order can be bad, and too. So we're kind of stuck in the middle, and it's just like people are just hanging on his word. Like, what what are you talking about?
Yeah, right.
Like, all you're doing is pushing, like, it's okay to be totally uncertain and confused, but as long as you invent a dragon called chaos and you figure out how to battle it in your own mind, really, in your own mind, it's like it pushes towards, like, it's just narcissism. It's just like it pushes people into their being their own gods in a way.
It's a Gnosticism, the idea that good is the flip side of evil and chaos is the flip side of logos and order. No, it's not. It's a privation. It's not the flip side. It's not the necessity. It's not the mirror other side of the pancake that helps you become the Ubermensch. That's all a bunch of gibberish and nonsense. Now, has God set up the world in a way that, yes, we will encounter difficulties, but if you don't have the fall in your worldview, and he does not, right? When you don't believe in the actual event of Adam and Eve and the fall, you're by necessity going to have a completely different anthropology. You're going to have a completely different theology of revelation. You're going to have a completely different Christology, a completely different worldview. You can't have, half of Christianity, or I'll take this cafeteria, this aspect of the Jesus archetype, and I'll have this aspect of the Nietzschean philosophy. I'll have this aspect of free market libertarianism that I like. Ooh, let me take this aspect of Carl Jung over here. That's not what Orthodox Christianity is. And of course, I actually appreciate that he has been honest and not tried to foist himself as some sort of proponent of Orthodox Christianity, because he's not. However, other people do foist themselves off as proponents of Orthodox Christianity, people like Pajot. So I think it's more dangerous when people are going in this route, and then they constantly counter signal. They constantly laugh at conspiracy theories. Pajot and Peterson laugh at conspiracy theories, by the way, which is hilarious given the fact that we're in the post-Epstein era, by the way. Who after Epstein can laugh at conspiracy theories? Like, you have to be the icon of normies, like the ultimate normie icon, to pass that kind of bullshit off as if that's like groundbreaking philosophy. Dude, get out of here with that nonsense. And that's why he won't debate.
I don't think he will. And it's like
neither Pajot nor Peterson would dare debate. It's ironic too, because in the debate with Dillahunty, right in the middle of the debate, Peterson almost does it, like he halfway does a transcendental argument. He does this transcendental argument about metaphysics, like kind of hinting that Matt needs metaphysics to make the claims that he's making. And then he just backs off of it. Like he doesn't take it anywhere. Like he could have clinched that debate with Matt right in the middle, and then he just sort of like, well, whatever. You know,
well, it doesn't matter.
Well, you know, whatever.
Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
It's not like we know what's true ultimately. It's like how do we even know?
How do we know when
true?
we don't know what we do know? And who even knows?
Yeah, it's like, what are you talking about?
Nobody knows. Yeah, so I mean, I try not to spend too much time on it, but because I like to punch up, and he is, in my view, up, and I think people need their views, and when they change language around, the irony is that he was put on the map for refusing to be forced to use language that he didn't want to, but parallel to that is the world where everyone's creating new definitions of things, and he does that. He redefines almost every definition he uses. He makes it elastic so that he can kind of poetically redefine it. And I know it because I've done it. I actually have a sort of like I guess I'm preconditioned to do it because I've lived in that world of relativism and pragmatism for so long, where I'll rather come up with a flowery definition of a word than stay strict to the word itself and break it down what that actually means. Like add a metaphor or say like it's like a this, like that just creates this broader sense of a word, and it doesn't help people discern truth using logic, because you need language to be pretty strict and clean to do logic, in my view, and that's kind of where I feel like he's pulling people away from truth. He's just leaving them in sort of like this cloudy, good feeling place where they're like, but I got out of that bad place, and it's like, that's great, but that's not an argument for truth. Like, good place, bad place isn't the measurement for overall good. You made that argument with someone that you debated a pagan. I don't know how old the video was, but it was like he was using how good his life got, which could be a measure of following something good, but it isn't the evidence of something good. It could be like a measure, like a subjective, like I did that in my life. Yeah.
What we think is good or useful is going to be conditioned by our worldview or our paradigm as a whole. So the point is that there's not, in a classical foundationalist sense, some brute fact that tells us immediately what the good is. I mean, what is the good, right? I mean, that to be able to say that one state of being in life is better than another state of being assumes one of these categories, metaphysical categories, namely the good. That's like the classic ethical, metaphysic category that Plato brings up. What is the good, right? What is it to live a good life? All right. So for Socrates, it's the examined life, right? That's what it is to live a good life. So you have in the Greek mind this assumption of reason and like reasoning skills being somehow better, in some qualitative sense, above just living a base party lifestyle, right? Like party like a rock star, or should you be the philosopher? Which dude? Well, in the Greek mind, you should be the philosopher. But why? On what basis am I supposed to assume or presume that living a mental, rational life focused on ideas and concepts and math or some boring shit like that, right? Like, how is that supposed to be better than the party lifestyle? Maybe I should live a hedonistic party lifestyle. There's nothing that on its face, by just talking about the good as a generic concept or category, that tells me which of these is actually better. You see what I'm saying? I mean, we just don't, like, you need the rest of a paradigm to tell you. Oh, you start saying, well, but if you party a lot, you'll get sick, you'll get, STDs, you'll get Yeah, but so what? Maybe if life is short.
Tautology. Yeah.
So all of our, the point is that what we're brought back to here is, once again, anything that we talk about is theory-laden, whether it's the good or whether it's logic or whether it's evidences or whether it's propositions or logic or beliefs or claims or politics. there's nothing that is neutral. Nothing that comes to us as a brute fact. Everything that we experience will be interpreted within our paradigm. And that's why the strength of the transcendental argument is that it's a comparison of paradigms, because there's no such thing as a brute fact that you could pick out. Even things that you think might be brute facts, like, well, we can all agree that things exist. No, we can't, because we don't even know what that means to exist. I mean, there are people who don't think that things exist. There are people who think that everything's an illusion, right? Like Maya or something. Like everything's just illusion, man. Like we're all in the simulation, man. So at a very fundamental level, like what we have to do is compare paradigms. And that's not like just, oh, you're saying that because you're some philosophical dude who's like talking word salad. No, I'm telling you, this is actually the course of philosophy. This is where philosophy went in its own debate and discourse with itself in its own history. It asked these questions from the time of Hume and Kant. And so to bring this back to Jordan Peterson, what you get, and I don't know if Peterson knows Kant, I don't even, but all it is kind of like the same questions that Kant asked or that Hume asked that continue in the empirical tradition, which is that, look, we don't actually know what's going on in the world. We don't know exactly what was going on in history. We can't know those things because we're limited individual people who learn things on the basis of empirical sense data. And since that's the case, the best that we can do in this Kantian Humean scheme, right, is just assume that the mind is structuring the phenomena of our experiences in a certain way. That's it. So what is God? God is a construct that helps us in the mind explain and make sense of reality. You don't actually know if there's a God out there in the world, in the metaphysical realm of the beyond. You can't know that by definition. Nobody can know that after Hume and Kant, according to people of that mindset. So what do you know? All you know is the phenomena that you experience, your existential dilemma, the sense impressions, the phenomena of experience that come into your mind. That's all you can know. And the best that we could hope for is that the mind has some kind of categories that are preconditions that structure reality. That's what psychology is based on. And we don't believe that. I am not a Kantian. Just because I use a transcendental argument does not mean that I'm a Kantian. Right? Any more than because I use a logical argument that Plato used, I'm a Platonist. It's not like that, right? So Kant is an empiricist. He's stuck in his own mind. We're not solipsists. We don't believe that your mind is divorced from the external world.
Right. And the way you described that was actually convincing. Like it was like you just made a convincing argument for that worldview.
That's how they would argue, since
you could be like, well, that's, that feels true.
Right.
But if you really think about it and just let it sit for a second, based on that view, even that claim can't be known or true. So it's a huge claim, and it's emotionally given, and they drive it home, and nobody ever questions, like, wait, what? In short formal logic, like what did you just say? And
what I said was that all we know is what's on the basis of sense data. But the problem is that ever since Hume and Kant, you can't even know that statement itself, right? So philosophy just went into skepticism. Now there's some philosophers in the continental tradition who question this, and they gave counter arguments and whatnot. But really, in my view, the only solid refutation of this is transcendental argumentation. There's no other way that you can argue against this, is to point out that itself is absurd. It leads to absurd conclusions. And so if something leads to the complete destruction of knowledge at all, then it's not true. You can't hold to it, because you're claiming to have knowledge. So the mere act of having knowledge disproves the idea that there's no such thing as knowledge, right? So
exactly,
a transcendental argument is just simply put, all it is if X is the necessary condition of Y, therefore X. That's it. That's all it is. If you're saying that if you absolutely have to have logic to make sentences, and you make sentences, then logic is true.
Yeah. And if you feel like you're someone who's not doing this, just know that everything you do and say, you're probably assuming a metaphysical reality that you can't produce with empiricism.
Exactly.
There's no way around it. That's the thing. Some people think the end is, there's no way around the sense data argument. But again, that leaves you back to doubling down on that. You're still resting on the metaphysical to even get to the empirical. So because the metaphysical must exist before the empirical process, like even the sense data process. You can't just sit there. And I'm pretty sure, I'm at least hopeful that your talk with Stefan got at least that thing in the door.
Mm-hmm.
Like I think the 7 coconuts may have opened the door to the fact, like he has to confront that 7 is not equal to the 7 coconuts. Yeah. Like there's a space between it, and you have to justify the 7 before you even argue the usefulness. So, and I think that's where, and another argument would be, and it's still a pragmatic argument, which is like, well, what are we supposed to do with this? Like, we can't do anything with it. That's like an argument that even Penrose made.
Yeah.
And, you're back to what do we do with it, which presupposes that we should be doing something and that we should be gaining knowledge, or put that all of our utility and our talents and our genius should be put forth towards something. So even Penrose didn't even realize in that he was still presupposing a metaphysical existence of something that says there's an ought, or we should use something. And it can't be just for survival. Like otherwise then any argument can be made if it's just for survival. Like you can't actually.
Well, yeah, and it's also ambiguous as to exactly what it means for something to survive. I mean, is that the survival of the species as a whole, or the fitter individuals amongst the species? I mean, there's nothing that immediately tells you which of those you're supposed to choose. I mean, let's say we're going to use this argument for the human species. Should we not select like the top, IQ people and then kill everybody else? I mean, is that what's best for the species, or is what's best for the species the maintenance of the largest numbers of the population? I mean, there's nothing that tells you immediately on prima facie which of those options is the one that you're supposed to choose when you just have these sort of pragmatic
that's why
best
Bill
for the
Gates
species
exists.
ideas.
Bill Gates has all the answers to that, by the way. He knows how many should die, who should die.
Well, there are, people in that
why.
tradition, people in this mindset, this technocratic mindset, like they actually literally think that they can create a supercomputer that will tabulate for you the moral calculus. I'm not joking. In the utilitarian tradition, they actually came up with the idea of moral calculus, that you could assign pleasure points. I'm not kidding. Pleasure points to different actions and tabulate those into like hit points as if you're playing some sort of role-playing game, right? And then like, this act, because there's a problem in this mindset, and I would say this, you could argue that this would be a problem for Stefan's UPB, because it is still roughly in that utilitarian framework. Like, how do you know whether the quantity or the quality of the pleasure principle is supposed to be preferred? Like, if I get, 7,000 pleasure points from, BDSM torturing people like some serial killer. Is that is that what you're supposed to choose? Or like, if everybody has like just a very, like mild buzz, like if 1 million people get a mild buzz, but I get like 7,000 pleasure point principle from torturing people, like which of these is the preferable utilitarian most good here?
And then what about those poor women who have that, that disorder where they have orgasms all day, every day, like every couple minutes? It's like, those people, do they win the game? Like, and how do they give us a thank you speech? It's like these things. Oh, something else I was thinking about Hitchens, because he always comes up, and I was thinking about, there's a specific line he always says almost in every debate, where he says, and this is a little bit of a tangent, but he's talking about the universe and the eternal darkness. Nothing is coming to you, and he says, how arrogant of you to think that all of this is built with you in mind. And I thought about that statement, and I'm like, I used to even follow him a lot and base all my arguments on him. And I was thinking about this in the car, is that that statement requires the same assumption for it to be useful or true. Like, in other words, you have to think the universe has you in mind to then analyze it in such a way that's so true and powerful for so many materialists. Like, you have to assume you're just as valuable as the person you're arguing with or your opponent.
Right. So in other words, to deny the anthropic principle that the universe is structured in such a way that human beings have meaning and can predicate knowledge about the external world assumes that you are functioning in that capacity to turn around and deny the anthropic principle that the universe is sustaining your existence and so forth. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. Like, for that to be true, for his statement to be true.
Yeah. I mean, he thinks it's a universally true statement. Correct.
Right. There's the only way for that statement to be true if it's not true temporarily or permanently. You know what I mean? Like, let me make this big statement about it, about the truth of all these things, and you'd have to be a special being for that to be true. Like,
yeah, it's like when I was debating JF and he says that it's universally the case that there's not binding laws and rules and principles, and that this is the case everywhere. As he turns around and says that we cannot ever have any universally binding principles, and I say, is that universally binding?
Yeah. Well, I love the thought of Sam Harris doing a talk about no free will and then signing the books after. I think
he wants his royalties, I'm sure.
Yeah, it's like, no free will. I'm Sam Harris. No free will. Hi, I'm Sam Harris.
Yeah, it's and then they'll turn around and say that, well, I'm going to act as if there is free will, but in fact there is not free will.
Well, that was his argument against against religion, where I think that's kind of where he lost it, because he knew he trapped himself. He was asked, like, if morality is totally made up and I have a kid, how do I push him to make moral decisions, and why is his life worth anything? Why is it worth making these choices? And he said, you lie. So he said, you lie. So in a way, if he thought Christianity or any other theism was a lie, he just advocated for lying, so long as gave them some moral model, which is just, I think he may have viewed that, and that's when he started the moral landscape. He was like, well, I can't deny morality, really, because I just ruined my own argument. I wonder where he's going to end up as far as his thinking. I just don't think you can maintain that position for very long if you encounter anyone who has even novice. I'm novice. I literally just discovered you and some other like basic logic and philosophy, and I'm like, this, just the basics throw these kind of worldviews upside down. And it's like, it's not to say, like, for atheists listening, like, I didn't prove God. Like, I didn't prove a specific God. The only thing I need to do is show the incoherency. And if you care about logic, you care about having a coherent view. I mean, just start there. I think that's important, just to start there.
Yeah, I think that it can be very complex talking about these kinds of arguments, this approach to apologetics and philosophy. But again, really, it always comes back to really basics. I mean, anytime in the examples you've given of Hitchens or people like that, anytime they make a sentence, me as an apologist, all I'm going to do is break down the sentence, what's claimed in that sentence, what that proposition or truth claim is saying, what it implies, and what's necessary for that to be the case. That's all I'm doing every single time. That's it, right? So if somebody says the universe has no meaning, right? This is you hear this one all the time, right? And if that's the claim that's made, then all I'm going to do is point out that this is a phrase, a sentence that's not just a sentence like that he's saying in his own subjective. I mean, he's making a universal claim, whether he knows it or not. Now, he's not going to like, just like when the debate with JF, like, he's not going to like that you're pointing out that's a universal claim. And he's going to deny that it's a universal claim, but the claim itself is a universal claim. I mean, it's saying that in all situations that we know of, in all possible worlds that we're aware of, at least, life has no meaning. If life has no meaning, then your life has no meaning. If your life has no meaning, then your week this week has no meaning. If this week for you had no meaning, then when you showed up to debate me, and you made sentences, the sentences had no meaning. Like, it's that easy. That's all I'm saying is you be consistent with what you're saying. But you don't actually believe that. You don't actually believe that words don't have meaning because you're sitting here arguing about meaning, and you're presupposing not just that sentences have meaning, but these truths that you are propounding, you think that they are absolutely the case.
Right. I mean, if you really believed it, you wouldn't have understood anything he said. It would have just been like, like, see, and then you would have been like, okay.
You would have been farting upwards. I think Kant or somebody actually makes this joke, like it's just farting upwards.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's like, I mean, that's the thing. That's coherence. That's like, can you live what you believe to any extent? And do you really believe what you're saying? Or are you just arguing because it might be possible and it's fun to get into that like buzzing state where nothing means anything and you feel totally
edgy.
detached or connected?
You're edgelord. Yeah.
Yeah, like you're connected to like everything is nothing. That term is consistent with that kind of argument where you're just like, I don't like, people seek not existing. That's the problem. Like,
that's true.
With these kind of views is that there's a market for it. And I've done similar work, you know, like I've done a lot of developmental work. I did something called landmark education, very heavy.
Have you developed your chakras? Is that what you're saying? Like you developed your chakras? Or
and
like,
then I did
like what kind of development did you do?
Oh yeah, and 10-day meditation called Vipassana.
Have you ever done juicing? Have you done like a 30-day juicing and then you'll cleanse all the thetans from your butt?
Oh yeah, because everything gets out. Like you need to get everything out. That's it. Become nothing. That's when you know who
Well, I guess
you
if you
are.
become nothing, then you do cleanse your body of all the thetans and the toxins, right?
Fate, yeah. Yeah, that was quite a fun, couple years of my life.
Oh, you actually did have like a new agey phase at one point?
Oh yeah, heavy.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, this education program was like, people call it a cult. It's super intense. It started with, you've heard of EST and stuff, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a
Werner Erhard, right?
Yeah, it became the branch of that became sort of commodified and created like a bunch of courses. And when you don't have a religion or any sort of foundational worldview,
right?
That's
you can be
coherent,
led into those things. Yeah,
you can. Oh, you let that in, and it makes sense. And then they borrow from all sorts of, they borrow from every religion, tradition, and they get you to a place of like nothingness. That the world is empty and meaningless, and their phrase is, it's empty and meaningless that it's empty and meaningless. And people do have this experience where the slate is wiped clean. They do push a version of forgiveness that actually works, but it's not based in anything objective. It's just like confronting a bunch of stuff. So I did get a lot out of it pragmatically, but again, back to that, it's like that can't be my measure for good. Also, I wanted to distinguish something, if you agree with this, is that people always use this like, this, what you call the dualistic, like the good and the evil, and there are these Satan and demons are trying to do all these things. And in my view, it seems that there's just good, and anything that departs from it can be called evil or expressed that way, because it kind of makes sense with light too. It's like darkness doesn't have its own entity or energy. It can't do anything. It's just the absence of light. Is that consistent with what you believe?
Dang it. I was trying to find quotes from the Sphinx from Mystery Men, and I was going to mystify you with, here we go.
Oh, good.
You must become the wolf pack, not the six pack. You must lash out with every limb like the octopus who plays the drums. Learn to hide your strikes from your opponent, and you'll more easily strike his hide. When you balance the tack hammer on your head, you will head off your foes with a balanced attack. He who questions training only trains himself in asking questions. Anyway, so I would
believed all, like that's all would have registered directly. 8 years ago.
The Sphinx is kind of a takeoff on Dalai Lama, because the Dalai Lama actually says like gibberish stuff like that. So I would say, yeah, evil. When we talk about metaphysical evil, for us, it has no actual substance or being. If it actually had any created ontological status or substance in itself, then we would be Zoroastrians. We would believe that God created two substances or forces, good and evil. And that would be a form of dualism, which we're not dualists. We don't believe that there's any inherent existence that evil itself possesses. So you're correct that we see it as a privation. So metaphysical evil itself does not have actual being, because everything that God created in Genesis is said to be good. He created all things good. Evil is then a privation, a lack in one sense. Moral evil is a movement of the will away from the good. And that's it, right? So to move the will away from the good, that's literally all we conceive of evil as meaning or being in the moral sense. So that's about it. I mean, yeah. When we understand it that way, and the reason we understand it that way is precisely to avoid and to reject any of the dualistic religions or worldviews, because most of the world religions fall into either monism or dualism. I mean, you actually don't have that many options in philosophies and worldviews. Even materialism, atheism, I mean, you could have a dualistic conception where there might be some materialistic atheists who believe that there's basically just matter and maybe some kind of conceptual something. Although I don't know how they could explain that. I mean, Plato seems to kind of have that in mind at times, but also Plato seems to be a dualist, where he thinks that there's this immaterial ideal realm, and then there's the lower realm of matter that's in flux, right? So that's a dualistic system where fundamental reality is two types of things, and you give a primacy to the things that are ideal. Like ideas are somehow better than, ontologically prior or superior to, they transcend. They're given more a higher status of towards the good than physical reality. Aristotle, he goes more in the direction of things being essentially material. I mean, he still has the notion of universals and concepts, substances and essences. He has a metaphysic, but he's not that concerned with anything transcendent. He wants to focus on the here and the now. So Aristotle is more of a scientist than Plato, the mystic philosopher. So, and you get this dialectic through the rest of the history of Western philosophy of people who tend towards things that are more ideal, more in the realm of the conceptual. Hegel, right? For Hegel, everything is just pure idea, and
right.
History is in the process of working out to a status of omega point, which is pure idealism. Even matter itself is in this rational process in Hegelianism. In Hume and then these other, Enlightenment people, the Baron d'Holbach, it's just materialism, right? I mean, it's just right. The world is just stuff. It's just physical. So
you want to hear what?
I mean, look. The whole point of all that, I'm sorry, it was just to say that like there's not actually that many options of worldviews. Like your worldview is either going to be some kind of monism where everything is one thing. You could be a Platonist and think everything's ideas. You could be a Hegelian and think everything's ideas. You could be a Richard Dawkins and think everything is just matter.
Right.
I mean,
yeah.
Or you could be a Zoroastrian and think that there's like two fundamental principles at work in the world. I mean, you don't have that many options of like.
There's not how many because they can't really believe any. Like that's the kind of view I'm taking now. It's like because everyone presupposes metaphysics and can't justify them necessarily.
Right.
Like I can't even call them what they normally would say they are because it's impossible to practice it. It's impossible to be that. So it's like I'm just going to remove their titles.
Yeah, I think that is the first step that we, at least temporally, chronologically, that's what we do in our own journey and in apologetics itself. We remove the foundations or the mistaken foundations in the erroneous systems that we encounter, right?
Hey,
yeah.
I'm gonna read a comment,
sure,
a real comment that was left on back to the Peterson. Someone suggested more Peterson impressions, so I figured I could say this.
You do it great, so yeah, do it.
You could play my internal mind questioning it. Okay, so well, faith is faith is like the possibility of like surviving the dragon in hopes our own resolve to conquer that which appears to be unconquerable. Without faith, we would just fight. We wouldn't fight. We would just die. That's real.
Is that a real Jordan Peterson quote?
No, it's a comment on his. This is what I find like fun about.
This is what people comment about.
Yeah,
okay,
people comment and they kind of like do like little like they talk in the same phrasing.
In his phraseology,
that which this and that which that, and it's all very flowery, funny.
I got you.
And then so I always like I always read that. I read his disciples' words always in his voice when I'm on the account itself.
I was talking to somebody the other day, and the term Gnosticism, and like they had no idea. I thought this guy would have known what that is, and so I think that when you get people like Peterson and other people, like when they repackage the Gnostic ideas, people don't even know. Like they don't recognize, they can't recognize what's being rehashed.
Right.
And I'm not trying to be rude or unfair to him, or I mean, it's the case even in other debates, like in the Dillahunty debate. Like I brought up stuff that, and I know Matt's maybe not like a graduate level philosopher, but I mean, I wasn't asking questions that were that difficult. They're pretty standard questions. I mean, if let's say if you're in the realm of philosophy or epistemology, there's a hand. Okay, I think we're back. It should be good here in a second. Yes, I know everybody's.
Is good now.
Yes, it's good now.
Still now working.
That was a bit of chaos.
Chaos,
Interjecting
and
itself in the metaphysics of my very being.
Without that crash, we could argue you wouldn't get to the places you needed to get to in a sufficient kind of way.
No.
I don't know.
No.
That's probably what it sounds like. It's
Right.
It's like 5 different worldviews just competing constantly.
Like in his head, they're all just arguing with one another.
And he's
There's
just
5 Jordan Peterson altars in the head of Jordan Peterson. They're just constantly debating one another.
Yep.
Collectivism, individualism.
So
anyway, so where were we? What were we talking about? I forgot.
We're just I don't even know, but I don't know if we should go even into because it's such a similar conversation. Like I'm just gonna try to get a good person to debate you about God and state and how the idea of rights or liberty or dignity or anything else already relies wholly on a metaphysical claim that something you can't access otherwise. That's transcendental. Like
Yes.
Life is good. Like
I'm trying to do the Wojak face when you said you're going to find somebody to debate me. I'm trying to do that.
I don't even know. I really want you to not on that particular topic, but the rational rationality rules. I
would debate that, dude. Absolutely.
He did a good job calling out Molyneux on his UPB, and he stays very it's hard to catch him in a moral claim or something inconsistent. So it really would be about not his consistency, but his overall worldview. And if there's a place where it doesn't make sense, I did watch a debate with him with someone about theism, and he argued that the argument was about whether it's rational to be theistic, atheistic, and by the end, he had admitted that. Being irrational is actually advantageous to survival. So, like, if I'm in the woods and I know there are maybe dangerous animals around, but I have an over-irrational paranoia about it or over-protection about it, it could save my life, it could be argued, even if it's totally irrational. Like, if there's
Why is your life
around.
worth saving? Like, what?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Well, that's
all these naturalistic accounts of why we're supposed to do something are just nonsense. It's laughable.
That's true. That's actually, I have to start thinking of that way, because I didn't even step back to look at that question. It was more like, well, you're arguing for irrationality and you're trying in a debate about why Christianity is irrational, but you just argued that something could be helpful if it's irrational. So, it's the same argument as like Sam Harris, but
Well, I mean, there's plenty of philosophers who have no problem arguing for just go kill yourself, bro. Like, why should your life have any significance or meaning? I mean, sometimes it's satirical. Camus and people like this, people can debate whether it's satirical or what. But I'm just saying, like, I mean, in the case of some philosophers, I mean, Sartre has a whole thing where he's actually like, if you really want to believe that you're free, if you really believe in freedom, I mean, you're free to kill yourself. So maybe you should. Now, I'm not saying I don't believe that a person should kill themselves. I'm not trying to advocate. I'm speaking of the way that some of the existentialists argue, and that they will actually make a consistent argument, quote unquote, consistent argument on the basis of atheism and nihilism for suicide. I mean, there are nihilist philosophers who actually would say that, why not? I mean, just read the Seraphim Rose book Father Seraphim Rose's book on nihilism, and he'll talk about the stages of revolutionary thought and atheism. Like, there's no anywhere in that system that you try to take some secular ethic or some telos or some purpose or some ends and mean that we're trying to get to. There's no reason for that. It's arbitrary. It's ad hoc. And it's like in the debate with Dillahunty, I was just asking him simple questions about, if I have to justify my belief in immaterial objects, concepts, and entities, why don't you have to? Right? I mean, you want me to. You say justify your belief in this immaterial entity you call God, and then I turn around and I say justify your belief in the immaterial entities that you utilize, that you admit you utilize, like logic, transcendental categories, and you say I don't, and I can't, and they don't have to be. That's called being arbitrary and ad hoc. That's a basic fallacy, right? And so I stress that many times, and he's just like, you're just asking me to do something that's impossible. It's not impossible, and he didn't even know that transcendental arguments actually are arguments. He thought you just presuppose things, and that you can't prove anything that's a presupposition. So he didn't even understand that it actually has a logical form in an argument. Right. But I'm just stressing that. I mean, the questions for these people are really, really basic. I mean, it doesn't matter which atheist you're talking about. Like, the whole system is purely subjective and relativistic, and that's just completely destructive.
So, like, the advice is try to stick with the transcendentals if you are in a conversation or a debate. Just like try to stay with what they are already
any sentence that they say
from the start.
Just take their proposition, take their sentence, deconstruct what that sentence claims, what it implies, what the necessary conditions are for that. That's all you have to do. Like, anytime, it doesn't matter what it is. Like, the simplest example is that, what's true for you is true for you, and what's true for me is true for me, man. This is what everybody says. This is stupid low IQ relativism that everybody says. All you have to do is just point out that that's incoherent. Right? Now, that doesn't mean that they're going to understand you or listen to you or buy your argumentation, but you don't have to worry about it. That's not up to you. You can't force people to believe and accept what's true. You can only present the argument to them. It's up to them whether they want to follow the truth where it leads, right? So you don't have to worry about that. But I mean, if you are sitting here telling me that nothing is true, all I'm going to ask you is it true that nothing's true? This is just dumb. Come on, man. Stop being dumb.
So wait, is the argument, for like, people go to owning your body, that whole sect, sort of libertarian natural rights, like you own your body.
That's a good question.
But that's just an is claim. Like, even if I said, yes, I own my body, you'd still need to add an ought. You'd have to justify an ought to say you shouldn't violate my ownership.
Right. So this is a kind of NAP, natural rights, private ownership. I would like, before we even get into the rights and all this, let's say, what is an I here? Okay. First of all, this is a notion of a self, of a person. What the heck is a person? What is a self? Right. These are metaphysical concepts that you've not established yet. Right. You haven't given me, and maybe you could in your libertarian philosophy. Maybe you're going to appeal to what? Enlightenment ideas? Do you not think that people have debunked and critiqued Enlightenment ideas since the 1700s? Like, you can just propose the idea of a self or an I as if that just has a self-evident meaning. What is an I? What's a self? Do you know how many philosophers don't believe in a self? Does Sam Harris believe that there's a self? Now when he cashes his checks, he does, but in his books, no, right? Consciousness is an illusion to most of these sort of deterministic philosophers. So what are you talking about? The I here that is claiming to have these rights. On what basis do you have right? What are rights? Nature? I see predators and prey in nature. So where are these rights coming from? Well, the dignity of man. Why does man have dignity? Maybe if man is just a product of natural forces, he doesn't have dignity. That's an illusion. You might like the idea of dignity, and you can make these practical arguments for why we ought to have dignity, but you can't get an ought from an is. Stating that man is a being does not tell you that man ought to then have rights as a being. Maybe he shouldn't. Yeah. Maybe I should have all the rights and crush the rest of you.
Right. I mean, it seems like it just goes right back to might. Might is right. That's the real
why not
end point.
I mean, if you're going to talk about nature, natural law, natural rights, I mean, it's just so like this has been debunked since the Enlightenment. Well, it's like thinking that this is ironic too, because they will criticize anybody who's a theist or has a religious worldview. So, oh, you're living in the freaking 1300s, bro. Some guy even said this on the Stefan debate. They're like, this guy wants me to step in a damn time machine, go back to the freaking 1300s, like I'm gonna live in a freaking monastery and I won't get my porn and my cumin. I won't be able to coon no more if I was living in the freaking 1300s, bro. Don't you know we got science and we got aspirins, we got Advils and microwaves, bro? You, dude. And I'm like, do you realize that the 1700s philosophy that you adhere to has also been deconstructed and debunked, dummy?
Right. The irony of that proposition of like libertarian anarchy is the irony is that the end of it is just the government. Like it's the same argument of like might is right. Like once you get to the end of the argument, it's just whoever has the most guns and power and who's willing to do terrible things will accumulate all of the power. And that's what your argument against government is. But that's the end game of that philosophy in practice. Like that's what, unless you can justify, but that's the other thing that I struggle with too. Like what good does it do that we can justify and present at least a coherent definition or defense of dignity and good and all of these virtues.
Yeah, it's in order to have the idea of dignity, you need the notion of a freedom and volition and choice, that you can make choices that are virtuous. So you need some kind of virtue philosophy, some notion of virtue. Now, I know that some of the people in the Aristotelian, the classical libertarian Enlightenment tradition will believe in virtue, ethics, and I know that, I'm aware of all that. But what I'm saying is that you can't just say that we have these ideas of virtue. Like you need a system and a coherent way to justify and place and give an account for virtues. You can't just say I believe in virtue ethics. Like where do they come from? What's the source? How do you know them? Right? Are they just based on the basis of tradition? Are they just what we read in Aristotle? Is it what some philosopher says in university? Is it out of a religious text? Like you need to have an account for where we get these ethical norms, these standards. How do I view the state? How do I view human dignity? What's the basis for human dignity? Do humans have freedom, right? So to talk about a self and to talk about rights assumes some notion of personhood. Personhood is a very unique philosophical concept that only comes to us in religious traditions like Christianity, right? So out of that older Hebraic tradition that is bequeathed to, I would argue, Orthodox Christianity consistently, you have the notion of persons. Persons are made in the image of God, who is personal. That's the basis for why man possesses the image of God, the Imago Dei. That's why he has dignity. Other systems, if you're just an emergent, bubbling forth of chemical reactions, I mean, you're basically just a more complex version of a milkshake. You don't have any rights. Right. Why would I give that? What does that mean? It's nonsense. It's just fiction. It's like it's metaphysical categories that are just as theoretical and made up as angels dancing on the head of a pin. You see, they're in the exact same category. There's nothing, right. And this is why you're right to bring up Hume. Hume is the most consistent of these people, and Hume has not been solved since these people posited this stuff. And Hume was consistent enough to say, look, you can't get an ought from an is. When things just are, there's nothing about things just being what they are that tells you what ought to be the case or what ought not to be the case. You can't, it's an invalid leap. And not only is that an invalid leap, the leap from induction to universal categories of principles is an invalid leap. There's nothing about particular instances that tells you what the universal category is, what the number 7, from 7 coconuts, that there's a 7. There's nothing about these things that tells you these metaphysical, epistemological, conceptual realities. And Hume was very aware of this, and he just says, look, let's give up this project and just admit that we can't answer this. We don't have
I have a question for you. What, you know how Kurt Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which is like at some point all logic is circular. I mean, we talked about, you mentioned this on another stream with Ananias, I forgot his name, the deacon, about how language itself, like orange is an orange. Like I'm learning as a father of a 3-year-old and a 1.5-year-old that some of the answers to their why questions are circular, like, or what is that? Like it's
exactly.
a this. Why is it a that? It's a that. It is an orange because it's an orange. And so the question is, when how can an atheist or someone with, in our view, an incoherent worldview, how can they use that to their advantage? The incompleteness theorem. Is there any way, or because I'm like looking at it and going, well, when can you use that, and when can't you? Like, when is circularity okay?
Oh,
Does
I
it
see.
You know what I mean? Like, is it endless regress? Is it like if we can get to the end of logic as far back as we can go to justify and create a cohesive view of everything, is that when it's okay to invoke the incompleteness theorem?
Typically, circularity is not a problem or something that we call, well, if we're doing normal logical problems, or we're analyzing standard type debates about this or that proposition or this or that belief or this or that political theory or whatever, we would call out a fallacy if it's circular, and we would be right to call that out. In cases where we are digging down to a level to where we can no longer question and we're forced to circularity, that's when we would say that it's unavoidable. For example, how do we know that words mean things, right? If we ask a question like this, there's really no way to discuss this or talk about this or explain this without using words, right? So we're forced at that level to engage in some form of circularity. How do we know logic is logical? Can we speak of logic being logical without being circular? No. We can't. So that's a meta-logical question. So when we start to ask questions that are called meta-ethical or meta-logical or metaphysical, typically at that stage, if we're digging down in our kind of epistemological analysis, we're going to be forced at some point to a level of circularity. And so what Gödel was showing against Russell was that when it comes to mathematics, ultimately any mathematical set is eventually going to appeal outside of itself. It's going to reach a kind of circularity. So you can never have a perfectly consistent mathematical system to model everything in the world. It would end up in a kind of a loop that would eventually appeal outside of itself, right? So Gödel proved that. And that's just an analogy, a mathematical analogy for the kinds of things that we see in philosophy that we call a kind of ground level circularity. And that's why the reason this is a problem is that it's a problem for what you brought up early on about the classical foundationalist approach. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because a lot of times if you're talking to an atheist and they hear you talking about all worldviews being circular, they'll say, well, ha ha ha, I've got you. That's a circular argument.
Right.
We're not talking about logic in its normal framework there, right? So, and we would actually agree with the atheist that, look, yes, we're not saying that you have a right to always like just be circular in your argumentation. No, if I said that I know that Socrates is a cross-dresser because Socrates is a cross-dresser, that would be a circular argument, and that would be an invalid argument. because Socrates is actually an FTM, female to male. No, I'm joking. I was trying to think of like the whole like the transvestigations conspiracy. Anyway, dumb example, right? So that would be a bad argument because I'm being circular, and it's an invalid use of circularity because that has nothing to do with one's paradigm, right? So in other words, it's a different order of question, right? Asking the question of whether we can argue that Socrates is a cross-dresser because he's a cross-dresser, that's not a good argument. I need a better argument to pull that off, right? But if I'm asking a question about can I analyze logic without using logic? You see how much more fundamental that is than, because ultimately, like, it doesn't really matter whether the proposition about Socrates is true or false. Like, that could be true or false, and it's not devastating to my paradigm for the possibility of knowledge at all. If logic is not logical, that's devastating to my whole paradigm and to the possibility of knowledge whatsoever. So this is why transcendental arguments are so strong and so necessary, is that they're preconditions for knowledge or experience at all, and that's why they're so strong. So that's a different order of question than questions that relate to just sort of empirical questions that could be true or false that don't really matter either way, right? Like, I see the dude across the yard. I think that Lil Wayne has moved in next to me because the dude has, shaggy dread hair like Lil Wayne. Therefore, it's Lil Wayne. Okay, right. That's a bad argument, right? It's not a good argument. But whether that argument is true or false, or whether it's wrong, or whether I'm making a circular argument, it's Lil Wayne because I think it's Lil Wayne, right? That's a bad argument. It's circular. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, if that's false, that's not devastating to my paradigm or to the possibility. Like, as if I were to say, logic is not logical. You see, two different orders.
So circularity used in the classical foundational, or just as we perceive things in reality, already accepting, even if it's unjustified, these transcendental categories, like that's when we're
saying that it's unavoidable. Like, it's impossible to avoid circularity at the paradigm level is really what we're trying to say here. So fundamental questions of metaphysics, epistemology, and ethics, they're going to of necessity be in some way circular because it's unavoidable.
So is that the line? Is that the threshold once you get into transcendentals that are requirements for truth itself? That's when circularity is inevitable.
Yes.
But once you get into classical foundationalism, that's when you can start calling it out in arguments. Is that a clean
classical foundationalism is a school of epistemology that is based on an older model to where you had properly basic beliefs or self-evident maxims that they believed weren't circular somehow. They just thought they were givens. Well, it's just true that we have like the law of identity. It's just self-evident that we learn facts from sense data. That's just self-evident, right? Yeah. So these older ideas, all the way back to Aristotle up into the Middle Ages and Aquinas, you have this pretty kind of basic notion of just everybody kind of assuming that that's the case. And it's not until modern philosophy after Descartes and the Enlightenment that people actually start to question, well, how do we actually know that on empirical bases? If we start with empirical observation as our starting point of our philosophy, we can't actually justify all of these moves that we're making in our epistemology, in our logic, as classical foundationalists. They're invalid moves because we haven't actually proven logic by empiricism. We haven't proven that the content of the external world matches up to the content in my mind, right? So people started realizing that the model of classical foundationalism was just assuming all these things that it couldn't justify. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that the things that it was doing were always false, right? We're not saying that if you're analyzing causation in the world, I mean, from my perspective as Orthodox, we're not saying that there's no causation. Obviously, that would be absurd, right? Causation is one of the many transcendental categories that are necessary for a coherent experience of the world. But we're asking a different question. We're saying that on empirical bases, if you're an empiricist, you can't justify causation. And that's a key argument that Hume brought to the table. Hume says, look, all you fellow skeptic atheist guys, bro, we don't have an argument for causation. We can assume it. We can act like it's there. We can't justify it because you can't, through empiricism, prove that causation is what you're experiencing. You see event A and event B. Where in event A and event B do you experience quote unquote causation? You don't. You have to assume it.
So for people who accept the transcendental, even if they take it to the point where they deduce the best or the most accurate, true, coherent worldview religion, they still do you think do you think daily operations change to a noticeable level where, because you do argue that pragmatism still plays a part, it's just not the basis. So is that even useful? Because in my view, like the whole experience of life and the search for moral truth and God, and it may be different, not in a subjective way. I mean, like the path, like people's paths and how they find these things. Like the argument is just about truth. There's no and I'm not saying there should be, but there's no you should do this because otherwise we're back in we're back in pragmatism in a way. That's the part of where I'm still I know what I can confidently say what the basis of good is. I can confidently understand these transcendentals as a necessity for experience and argue for God's necessity without understanding any essence or anything that I can actually describe about God. But I guess the question is is it even not a good idea to pursue or to argue these things inside of the context of why, because then you're back into your life will get better. That's the thing that I ponder a lot. Where do these conversations lead to? And we don't want to go back, to that paganist that you debated. We can use improvement of life and happiness and oneness and everything we can experience directly as a result of accepting God. But is it useful to even use that personal experience as a testimony to some level?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes. So there is a pragmatic component. Absolutely. If you are aligning yourself with the truth and you are seeking the truth, it will definitely be beneficial to you and you will find pragmatic advantage to that. The problem is that there's no, if you think about it philosophically, and not everybody does, but if you think about it philosophically, there's no self-evident pragmatic criteria that automatically tells you that, oh, well, Christianity is true because it's the most helpful to me. Well, I mean, that's assuming from the outset the thing that you haven't really established or you don't know yet, right? So, but I would say that when we think of it holistically, when we think of comparing systems of thought, it's a better way to approach this debate, this question, because like we said earlier, there's only a limited number of options you have in a worldview. Because a lot of times the atheists or people say, well, how can you make this argument until you refute, 1 million worldviews out there? There's millions of worldviews. So you can't really make this argument until you've actually gone through one by one and disproved every one of these arguments. Actually, no. Again, if you just look at from the vantage point of philosophy, everybody has a philosophy. Everybody's got some view, a limited number of views in the three basic categories of philosophy: ethics, metaphysics, and epistemology. That's the only three there are. And everybody has some view in each one of these branches. And there's a limited number of ways you can go in each one of these branches, right? And like I said earlier, most worldviews, most options that you have out there, unless you want to get creative and start making up your own, which I guess cult leaders, some people do this, right? You can choose a monistic religion, one where everything is Maya, illusion, or idea. You could choose a dualistic religion. You could choose a nonsense religion. I mean, you have a limited number of options. But the problem is that you're going to run into big roadblocks. And I want to stress, though, that I actually think that the transcendental argument is very practical. It's very pragmatic. Because in my daily life, I'm not just making theoretical arguments on the internet and then like that has nothing to do with my daily life. Like if I'm balancing my checkbook, I'm using mathematics that makes sense in a worldview where God exists and numbers are a reflection of the divine mind. I'm doing, living out, even though I mess up, I'm living on the basis of an ethical code that makes sense because humans are made in the image of God, and we have the Ten Commandments, we have the revelation of Scripture. If I'm studying something and I'm doing, creating something, that's on the basis of there being principles that are regularity, as it's called, right? Induction, because God rules the world providentially. So induction makes sense in a world where there's a God who providentially governs the world. Yeah. Induction doesn't make sense in these other worldviews. Everything's an illusion. Yeah. How are you going to do science if everything's an illusion? That's ridiculous. Right. So
there's also a good, decent argument if we're just talking in the pragmatic sense.
And I was going to say, there's a pragmatic way you can approach the transcendental argument as well in many different ways. You can just say things like, look, this is a healthy worldview within its own paradigm, within its own system. This does promote your own well-being and health, right?
Yeah.
If you want to be pragmatic like that, and you have an ethical standard which helps a community to flourish, right? If your community abides by the Ten Commandments, you're going to do well. You're going to flourish. You're not going to be raping everybody and killing. Are they raping everybody out here? You don't have to come and confess. They're looking for you. We gonna find you, right? You're not going to be living in that community if your community believes in the Ten Commandments.
Right. Yeah. I guess. Yeah. That's. And then also the other side is like, even from my own personal life, it's like when we act consistently with how the world occurs, and the world can just occur to you and you don't have any control and you're just responding and reacting, or you can adhere to a worldview and it occurs consistent with that because like the worldview, like nothing matters. Hedonism, nihilism, do whatever, it's all fine, no one cares. It will produce a predictable kind of behavior. Right. It's not like like what the argument of why it's wrong or immoral, like you don't even need to go there yet. I mean, it's easy to take that step, but I mean, that's at least a partial argument, at least in the pragmatic sense of like, why hurt yourself? Like, there's a perfectly good reason why you shouldn't harm people and yourself. And it's not consequentialism necessarily. Yes. If though pragmatism kind of points to consequentialism, like it inevitably points to like, look what happened, look what you did. But that's an interesting leap because I'm right now, I take it into my life and but as far as me impacting other people, which I now kind of assume a responsibility because of the things I'm interested in and how I'm relaying them sparks questions, and people direct message me, and so many people after I started talking about this stuff asked me, where do I get more of this information on this particular like stance or argument? Like I sent so many people your channel and
thanks. That's awesome.
Eternal Church guy. I forgot what is his name. I just call him
Patrick at Church of the Eternal
like
Logos.
His view, I like his like how he does it and models it out and shows slides. But it's just people are hungry for the logic part of this. Like it's been years. I mean, this may have just been hidden. I mean, I know that this overall worldview, including the orthodoxy, is like it's just like 4%, or something. Something's very small. But that makes sense why this particular argumentation isn't popular. It's like it's just not used, but people are so hungry for the logic part of it because it's been taken away. Yeah. And it allows them to participate in their own spirituality. It opens to me, it's the doorway. It's like the doorway wasn't actually my parents just taking me to church and forcing me into Sunday school and saying all the stories and reading the Bible to me, because there's no context. Like the logic itself is the precondition for the context to receive this information, the text, understanding this stuff. If you just skip past the transcendental argument and not understand it, you're only going to be interacting in that classical foundationalism, which is like you put that on a kid, like it's, in a way, like the atheists are pointing out a problem, like in a way, like not that something's not true, not that
they are
valid argument,
absolutely,
but they're pointing out why it's not being cohesive and well argued and well understood. It's because you're just delivering it from that basis, from that classical foundation. And the parents don't even know what that means. They just go like, well, it's good. You just give them a model and like, I don't know. Like they didn't do the work. Yeah. And again, it's like, it's not like everyone has the time and the effort to really get in there, but at least that one category, that one argument is broad enough for people to understand. And it's been great to share it with people, because it's not like this. It's not preachy. It is for the intellectual snobberies who are attracted to the Petersons. It's like it is accessible to people who are kind of afraid to acknowledge there might be a God or say it, and they want to weigh into the argument where they feel confident in exploring it from a logical perspective, because it's logical. It's like, I didn't return to theism or even the urge to know God again, or to find it, just to even take a step, right? Like, it wasn't this typical thing you'd see in like a movie, like where there's this angelic moment, or like something else happened, or I prayed and it happened to work out that time. It was logic.
Exactly. I mean, it occurred to me back when I was 18, 19, 20, when I was first getting into transcendental argumentation. It occurred to me back then that, well, I mean, if Christianity is true, if what you're saying about the Logos is true, if the second person of Godhead is the Logos, then there's got to be some way that logic and philosophy and argumentation, truth, even if it's truths about the created world, like that still has to have its source in the capital L Logos. Right? Like you can't. So the whole idea of like the anti-intellectual, sort of anti-rational, irrational, fideistic approach to this stuff that you get from evangelicalism most of the time, from these goofy mega churches, it was just like totally nonsense and unappealing. And if that's all Christianity or religion is that kind of stuff, then it makes perfect sense to be an atheist. That would have been an atheist or something else a long time ago, but. In God's providence, I was introduced to, transcendental argumentation back when I was 20, 21. So I got really deep into it. Read Van Til's Big Fat Apologetic by Bahnsen back then. And I was sold on it ever since. And I'm not saying that was made me special or anything, but it did actually in college, I think, kind of block and barricade my worldview from being susceptible to the kind of just typical atheist arguments, because I was pretty quickly, sort of engaging the professors in arguments on the basis of transcendental categories. And most of the time, especially if they were more of the atheistic materialist mindset, like they just really weren't prepared for that kind of stuff. They didn't know how to respond to that, because they'd never heard that kind of an argumentation. So, and I've never heard, in the 20 years that I've studied this and written on this and done debates, I've never heard a coherent response from an atheist. I mean, the only attempt was Michael Martin who tried to come up with Tang, the transcendental argument for the non-existence of God. I have a whole talk on that. It's pretty easy.
What was that summarized? It's
pretty easy to debunk Tang. He actually didn't even show up for his debate. Like he was supposed to debate Bahnsen on Tang, and Martin just backed out of it, never showed up. So Bahnsen debated himself as Michael Martin, which is pretty hilarious. But the argument is just basically that if we assume God's existence, then that means that we could make a reverse argument where God could conceivably change the laws of logic, and so therefore the laws of logic could be completely irrational, and therefore the assumption of logic could also logically lead to the non-existence of God. But it really misses the argument, and it misunderstands what it means to say that logic presupposes God. we don't actually, I wouldn't say, I think it would be ridiculous to say that the laws of logic are changeable. They're a reflection of the divine mind. So in a sense, they match up to God. They're not definitional of God. They don't define God, but they do tell us to a degree truths about God. And Scripture says this, right? I mean, this is what the logi are. They're the patterns and principles of the created order. And they're ultimately patterns on the basis of what they are in Christ and the Logos. So that's why the world has order. We don't say that any of these logical patterns is definitional of God, right? God is not equal signs logic, right? It's a little more complex than that. But there are things that bind God, namely God's own character, God's own nature. So, for example, Scripture says, Paul says, God cannot lie, right? So you're never going to get a situation where God openly lies. In our worldview, that would be impossible. And so there are, in a sense, you could say, logics that bind God, namely God himself, right? The ultimate highest category would be God himself. And so God is bound by his own nature. He can't make himself not exist. He can't will himself not to be, because he's bound by his own character. And so that's actually the response to Martin. But Martin's argument was premised on the idea that God himself is somehow equated to logic, and so that we could just define omnipotence to be that God can make the laws of logic to be the opposite of what they are, which that's not, we don't even say that that's what omnipotence means, right?
Right. Well, the hypothetical also, you could just add another scene, if you will, where he changed the laws of logic and then he changed them back. So it's like you can just keep adding if you want.
Well, his argument was that if that is even possible, and if God's omnipotent, then it has to be possible, then everything is incoherent. And so therefore the transcendental argument also proves the complete incoherence of everything. But that's not the argument, because we don't say that omnipotence means that God can change the laws of logic to be nonsense and gibberish. If you want to watch it, I have a whole talk just on Tang.
Yeah, I'll check it out. Yeah,
I'll
it's funny
put
when
that in the
people
chat.
do the unicorn. Someone did that in the comments recently. Like, I could just say, the unicorn is the basis of the transcendentals and so forth. And
yes,
they didn't realize they're borrowing the conceptual world. It has to precede their ability to create the unicorn.
Well, this is a misunderstanding, of what the transcendental categories are and how they all relate to one another. So the argument is more than just saying that, I presuppose God, therefore my worldview is coherent. We're actually looking at all of these transcendental categories. I mean, you can start listing them. There's many of them. And we're asking the question then of, how do these transcendental categories make sense? They don't operate on their own. You can't have a conceptual framework that operates outside of a mind. You can't have a mind that operates outside of some transcendental unity that perceives these phenomena of experience. So there's some kind of a self that is the unifying substrate of the mind, right? You can't have a mind and a self without some notion of personhood, I would say. And so you start getting into these philosophical categories. You can't have these things without that being having choice and free will. Why do we think that this being has free will? We have notions about metaphysical categories of choosing this or that option in the world, words having meanings, concepts relating to the world, sentences, predicates, etc. All of these things start piling up, and then we start to ask, how do all those things cohere and relate together? Well, guess what? We need a worldview. We need a worldview that gives a basis, a structure, a way that all of these things fit and work together. How many are there out there? Guess what? There's not that many worldviews that give a coherent account for these things. There's a very limited, and by the way, you can start narrowing them down, right? Because you might say something like, what about Islam? Because Islam might be able to say that there's a divine mind and there's a coherent, way to understand the man's will. And that's when it gets into more of the theological argumentation. You're forced to specify the notion of simplicity in Islam and the deity of simplicity and whether that God can actually interact in this world. And actually, I think in Islamic philosophy and theology, there's a serious problem as to how that being who has absolutely no similarity to the world, and to his attributes have absolutely no similarity to any created thing. There's no way to speak of or know that entity, or for that entity to interact in time and space. It actually becomes impossible. This is an argument that relates to Tawheed, but we were going to save all that for Ijaz, but Ijaz backed out of the debate. So I was supposed to debate Ijaz, the lion of Islam, who was going to eat me like a lion, and he backed out. That's okay.
Have you debated? Every, at least modern, spokesperson of other religions, like to take the logical approach to debating what parts don't make sense.
I would.
You did a pretty easy job with the paganist, because he just said logic. He doesn't have to be logical.
He doesn't care about logic.
Said, I don't have to be logical.
Right.
But it would be great if they had better representation, so that you could actually get to the meat of it, of like why.
Feel free to help recruit them if you want to scout them out, because we can't find them. They're very difficult to find. The last debate that we'd hoped for was Ijaz, and he may still do it down the road. I don't know. And then we had hoped that inspiring philosophy, more like uninspiring philosophy. He chickened out. He said I was too mean, which is ridiculous. But so yeah, we have a hard time finding people who are not, most of the time the people that want to debate are like the really hard-headed people with like 500 subscribers who are, just like out of their mind, like, I'm gonna crush you, I'm gonna destroy you, and they'll make 5 hours of videos about how you're the worst human being ever, and then like when they come to the debate, they completely melt down, right? So this is the typical problem that we have. So we've been trying to aim for higher tier guys, and shout out to Lewis and all the Ortho Bros, because Lewis has been really good at finding higher tier people to debate, but not a lot of people in the religious world actually get that deep into philosophy. So this is a little bit of a problem that, there are people who do apologetics, but it's hard. It's harder than you think to find people who really want to engage at a philosophical level on a lot of these topics.
Well, anyone who's in the chat or watches this after this is posted, definitely go to Rationality Rules and leave kind comments, and invite him, because he's definitely willing to debate a lot of people I've seen, and I think you guys would produce a really good episode.
Let's do it.
And go head to head. So Rationality Rules is the channel. So just like, hey, you should debate Jay Dyer.
Yeah, be glad to. You want to move on to the super chats? You have any final ideas?
No, just thanks for what you do. Go follow Church of the Eternal Logos, and could you plug the other guy, the deacon? Because I watched his
Father
videos,
Deacon Dr. Ananias. Absolutely,
yeah, I never know the name. Yeah.
Yeah, so definitely, I'll add some of those links. Now I've got your links here because it's we're interviewing you here.
And I have a book, Savage Memes Volume 2. There's definitely a transition between my Volume 1 ideologies that I was kind of pushing or kind of playing with, and I'm getting a little more philosophical and stuff, but it's still savagery and brutal. So Volume 2, I think my the free shipping code is Liberty still, if you want. This is pre-orders, so taking all the pre-orders, and then it's somewhere in May we start packaging and shipping them all.
Awesome. So yeah, follow JimBob. You got his links here in the description. Definitely go follow Church of the Eternal Logos, and follow Father Deacon Dr. Ananias over at Norwegian News. And we got the translator. Thank you for joining the channel. Private Death, $2. I love your art, JimBob. Private Death giving you a shout out. Jolene K, $10. Thank you, JD, always, and God bless. Thank you, Jolene K, longtime supporter. Shout out to Jolene, also a big supporter of the Boiler Room. So shout out to Boiler Room. Everybody, be sure and listen Thursday nights over at the Spreaker app, and sometimes on my channel to the Boiler Room. Slav K, £2. Jay, will there ever be a return of Pastor Randy Balls? I would say that you need to go hit up Mr. Guttermain go tell Mr. Guttermain on IG, on Instagram, Leroy on Instagram, that he needs to do a Pastor Randy Ball sketch, because he might have possibly been tossing around the idea of doing that. So go tell Leroy that Pastor Randy Balls needs to make a return, and maybe that'll happen one day. Thomas W., he says, for $2, Kierkegaard or who? Also, I'm now a catechumen. Thank you, Jay. Well, glad to hear that, Thomas W. Glad to hear that. What do you mean, Kierkegaard plus or who? I think Kierkegaard is good. I'm not a Kierkegaard scholar. I've read a couple of the books. I liked This Present Age. I did a talk on This Present Age. I read one of his other selections from Sickness Unto Death, which was good. But I'm not super a master of Kierkegaard. But he's definitely worth reading. He's definitely insightful. He's probably one of the closest philosophers to orthodoxy. This Present Age is neat because it's very prophetic about the mass media age. So he was writing before the mass media age, but it seemed to amazingly predict it. So I don't know who else to recommend. Westo, 2 pounds. Jay, have you ever had a supernatural experience? I have had my bad LSD trip experience, which I've told in many. I'll spare you this now. I was actually thinking about doing a trip report as a joke again, but. So that's JimBob. Have you ever had any supernatural bad experiences?
Bad experiences? No, I mean,
good.
doing those kind of things back in my 20s, I had bad experiences, but they weren't supernatural because I was directly experiencing them in my body.
Oh, okay.
But I've had moments where I can't explain certain things or why they, even if they were explainable, what happened, I couldn't explain why they happened. But
cool. Raffling Steaks, $10. How do you handle the empiricist pragmatist claim where they say that they accept immaterial concepts like laws of logic because they are demonstrable and applicable in the material world? I would say that's to beg the question, because that's just restating that this is kind of the Dillahunty approach. He realizes that these things are needed, these kind of categories and laws and principles, but that's not a sufficient justification or reason or an account for how and what they are. That's just stating that they are. So that's to beg the question. And what we're asking here is we're saying, at a metaphysical level, what are these? Where are they? How are they? Why are they? Right? And they'll just simply say, well, you can't ask those questions. That's not a fair thing. But then they'll turn around and say, how is God? Why is God? Give an account for God. Where is God? You see, they'll do the exact same thing. And then when you ask them for that, they'll just state that it is the case. They'll be ad hoc. So just stating that the logical laws is being arbitrary and ad hoc. That's not giving an account. And we're asking for an account for them. We can give an account. They may not like our account, but we can at least give a coherent account for them. So
also, one thing to add to that is that people kind of confuse the word justify with like explain. Like it sounds the same, but in that term, in that context, it's like they're just saying, like what you just said, like it's like a tautology. Like why is murder wrong? Because it's killing someone. It's like like justify why it's wrong, and it's because it hurts them and they bleed and stuff.
Right.
And it sounds like Dillahunty and they all do the same thing where they just redefine what those things are and what the use is, and it doesn't. Like what you said, I just find that it's a common thing, the justification versus explanation, which are you could interchange them in a lot of scenarios, but I wonder if there's a better word. Is there a better word
for
that
what
is more direct than justification? Like,
in philosophy,
like
we speak of necessary or sufficient conditions. We speak of warranted beliefs. We speak of preconditions, assumptions. Those are kind of the typical philosophy terms that you'll hear about these things. But I think so. The way you've phrased this, Rolfing Stakes, is really I would just say read Hume. what these people aren't understanding is that the questions that Hume raised back in the Enlightenment have not been answered by empiricists. And the paper by Quine, right, The Two Dogmas of Empiricism by W.V.O. Quine, is a reaffirmation of the fact that Hume's challenges have never been met or solved because they can't. You can't, on an empirical basis, justify empiricism. So in your example where you say that the empiricist pragmatist just says, well, look, laws of logic are demonstrated because they work in the world. That's not a justification. That's a statement about perceived fact or observation, and it's begging the question. We're asking, how does something immaterial, conceptual, invariant, and abstract interact with a world that is pure matter and flux and physicalism? That's the question here. Like, on the grounds of empiricism, it doesn't make sense. It can't work. We don't have an account. It's just a statement. Right?
And also, when you get them to the place where they say, well, I can't account for it, and if they say, I can't account for it, but, based on science and reasoning and evidence, we may eventually get to it. Like, don't let them off the hook when they go there.
That's called faith.
Yeah, it's faith, and it's also just appealing.
It's like
to
one day science will have an answer for this. Oh, so you appeal to a faith-based worldview where in the future one day science will give an account. No, it'll never give an account, because how will you ever step outside of empiricism as an empiricist? You can't. Jake Bird, $5. He says, can you speak about metaphor in the structure of language? Does it relate to the Orthodox worldview? Will you do a talk on St. Nikolai Velimirovich? Sure. I mean, I've read multiple things from St. Nikolai Velimirovich, but I don't know exactly. I mean, he has that book on symbolism and, allegory and symbol in nature, and how nature itself is kind of a cosmological sacrament. Sure. That's a great book. It's a classic. It actually doesn't go super deep. It's pretty surface level, which is not bad. It's a good introduction to that stuff. But I'm not exactly sure what you mean about metaphor in the structure of language. I mean, does it relate to orthodoxy? Sure. I mean, language has its own kind of logi, or logical structure, which ultimately relates back to the divine mind. And metaphor would be part of that. Scripture uses metaphor. But I'm not, you'd have to be more specific, Jake, on exactly what you mean by metaphors in the structure of language. I mean, if you could fill that, if you want to expand in the chat on that, I'll try to answer that. If you lay out more what you mean. Jack, $2. Is it possible that Jesus was black? No. Jesus has to be the descendant of the house of David. He has to be the descendant of Abraham. And Abraham and David's descendants were not black people, despite whatever the black Hebrew Israelites say. Sorry, but they were not black people. In fact, our iconography pictures Jesus as the Hebrew dude that he was. He was not a black dude. And so he's not Chinese. He's not, you can't do the Jesuit nonsense thing of like painting Jesus into whatever ethnicity you want him to be, because he was of Jewish descent. That's ridiculous. It's Gnostic what they do. George's Journal, $4.99. Wash your balls, bucko. Yes, we will both wash our balls tonight, bucko. Thank you. Amy Polino, $20. Thank you, Amy. Fat super chat. Much appreciated. Email Surik, $5. Jay, why didn't you ask or press Stefan on the non-aggression principle? So a couple of people said, why weren't you more ferocious? First of all, that was Stefan's channel. So I was on Stefan's home court. I'm not going to be a ferocious bulldog when at any point I could have been easily muted or booted. So there was no point in trying to come out ferociously. And furthermore, I wanted to have the option to have future conversations. And so if there are future debates or discussions, I will bring up the non-aggression principle. I will bring up other aspects in the UPB. So I didn't know where the chat was going to go. But no, I wasn't like secretly avoiding discussing NAP. I think NAP is a pretty easy, funny way to take the discussion at any time with a libertarian. But yes, I will try to bring that up next time if we have another debate. Palmer Elric, $10. Always great content. Thank you, Jay. Thank you. And we thank JimBob for coming on. Shining Diamond, $2. What is the orthodox position on economics? I would argue that it's more consistent with a distributist type of position. Just look up sobernost, right? So if you look up the orthodox conception of sobernost, kind of similar to, ideas in distributism. You have a duty to the community. It's not just you raking in and stacking cash, bro. ML Surik, $5. Could you say, with a coherent worldview, that there is an alignment across the philosophical spectrum of pragmatism, utilitarianism, and empiricism? I think the problem with these systems is that they have a partial truth. I mean, this is the thing with philosophy, is that it's not that every one of these schools of philosophy is totally wrong. It's that every one of these schools attempts to have their school give you the grand narrative account of all philosophy. It attempts to have the single overarching explanation for everything, right? So, yes, pragmatism explains everything. Yes, idealism explains everything. Yes, everything is about utilitarianism. Yes, everything is just empirical sense data. And really, these are just elements of a coherent, holistic worldview, right? We have an empirical sense data element, sure. We learn things from sense data, absolutely, right? We have a pragmatic aspect of our worldview, sure. We should have an aspect to where we do things that are practical and pragmatic. We do have an element of utilitarianism, right? Things do have a utility for us, right? There is a notion of common good, right? So, but it's within the whole context of everything else. You can't just pick out these particular things, like build some entire giant system on just utilitarianism or empiricism. It's ridiculous. Nicodemus the Pharisee, $2. Does orthodoxy teach baptism of desire? Yes, it does. All right, so that is all of the super chats I see presently. Make sure I didn't miss any. See if Jake Berg. I don't see Jake filling out any more of his questions. JimBob, thank you, man.
Well, thank you. Thanks everyone in the chat. And I need to every once in a while jump on and get to talk to someone in longer form, because my thumbs don't do the trick and I can't really, it's not fun.
I hate debating with thumbs and text.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and then in the meantime, I'll definitely look for candidates for you to debate on various topics. Because I just think cool. The general argument is super important, and it's not being presented in all, even the smaller circles, that we know.
Right.
Who knows?
Appreciate
Why
that.
don't you have Penrose on? I bet we can get him on.
I guess I could reach out to him. It never even occurred to me to reach out to him, but I'm not opposed to that. Nicodemus drops another super chat, and he says, who's the best living philosopher or most recent?
Jordan Peterson.
I would probably say somebody who's an Orthodox philosopher. So maybe Larche or Father Staniloy, because he would apply his Orthodox theology to his philosophy. So I would say read Larche or read Orthodox Dogmatics by Staniloy. All right. Thanks everybody. We had almost 400 tonight. I think at one point we did reach about 400 live. So thank you all for coming. Follow, check out the links below, and have a good night.
See you guys. Am I staying on?